1945, Bavaria lay in ruins. The war was over, but for thousands of German women captured by the Allies, a new kind of uncertainty began. They were no longer soldiers, nurses, or workers of the Reich. They were prisoners, displaced in foreign camps under the watch of their former enemies. The days stretched long behind barbed wire, where hunger gnawed at pride, and the scent of foreign food drifted across the camp like an insult. The Americans, ever pragmatic, had introduced their version of Middle Eastern street food, shawarma. Strips of roasted meat, wrapped in soft flatbread, dripping with sauce. But to the German women, raised on dense rye bread, boiled potatoes and sauerkraut, it looked and smelled alien. They wrinkled their noses, whispered among themselves, and pushed away the steaming plates with quiet defiance. "This is not food," one said. "This is something animals would eat." Yet fate has a strange way of humbling even the most stubborn hearts. Hunger, nostalgia, and curiosity can weave powerful magic. And one evening, as the sun dipped low behind the wire fences, something unexpected happened. What began as disgust turned into discovery. What started as rejection became a lesson in humanity shared through the universal language of taste. And in that unlikely corner of an American-run POW camp, a story unfolded, not about war or surrender, but about a simple meal that bridged two worlds once divided by hatred. A soft cinematic music rises. The smell of grilled meat fills the air. A camera pans over the campfires and watchtowers. The first time the American cooks wheeled in the makeshift shawarma spit, the camp fell silent. Even the wind seemed to pause, hanging between the fences and the weary faces of the captured women. It was late afternoon, and the sunlight dripped through the wire mesh like honey, glinting against metal and dust. The smell came first, thick, smoky, alive, an aroma that didn't belong in this place of dull rations and powdered meals. It drifted through the camp like a trespasser, a stranger, a whisper of something foreign. Behind the wire, a few of the women looked up from their chores, washing uniforms, hanging blankets, counting the minutes until evening. Their eyes followed the smoke curling upward from the American cook setup. They saw the glistening skewers, the turning spit, and the unfamiliar color of the meat slowly browning over the open flame. It wasn't German. It wasn't anything they recognized. Inside the fenced yard, time had stopped moving long ago. Everything had become predictable. The whistle at dawn, the roll call, the tasteless stew ladled into tin cups, the endless waiting. But this smell, it unsettled them. Was this das? One woman muttered, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is that?" No one answered, because no one knew. The guards stood a few meters away, chatting casually, as the American cook, a man named Corporal Dunn, adjusted the spit with practiced ease. He wore his sleeves rolled up, his skin browned by the sun, his movements quick and confident. He wasn't just cooking, he was performing, turning the meat with precision, occasionally slicing off pieces that sizzled and hissed as fat hit the coals below. A few of the women grimaced. One turned away. "It stinks." Another whispered, "Grease and spices. Filth." But her stomach betrayed her with a quiet growl. The war had stripped them of everything. Pride, home, certainty. Yet what lingered most was hunger. The kind of hunger that lived in the bones, that hummed quietly in the background of every conversation. The Americans fed them, not well, but enough. Bread, beans, canned meat. It was food that kept them alive, but never full, never satisfied. And now this new dish, this shawarma, as they later learned, was being prepared not far from their barracks. The Americans had begun experimenting with different foods, using ingredients left from supply lines, feeding not only themselves, but the prisoners too. To them, it was nothing special, just another meal, a break from the monotony. But to the women watching behind the fence, it was an intrusion. They had grown up on boiled potatoes, cabbage soups, dark bread dense enough to crack a tooth. They believed in food that was plain, strong, and simple. Food that didn't pretend to be anything more than nourishment. And this swirling, fragrant mass of foreign meat offended them. It was too colorful, too loud, too alive. One of the older women crossed her arms and shook her head. "They think we'll eat this nonsense," she said with disdain. "They treat us like children." But one of the younger girls beside her, maybe 19, maybe 20, said nothing. She was watching the flames, her blue eyes reflecting the firelight. She hadn't eaten properly in days, trading her bread ration for a bar of soap earlier that week. She didn't understand why, but something about that smell pulled at her, not with longing, but with memory. She thought of her mother's kitchen, long before the war, the smell of roasted goose, of onion and fat, of something warm. The American cook noticed their stares. He smiled faintly, not mockingly, just knowingly, the way a man might smile at a stray cat peeking from behind a fence. He gestured toward the spit, calling out something in English. The women didn't understand the words, but they caught the tone inviting, almost teasing. No one moved. An hour later, the first plates were carried past the gate, soft flatbread filled with thinly sliced meat, drizzled with sauce. The guards took theirs first, eating casually, talking between bites. The sound of chewing, the crunch of bread, the murmur of approval, it all echoed through the yard like music from another world. The German women turned away, muttering under their breath. They would not be humiliated. Not like this. "It's disgusting," said one. "Look at it. Dripping like that. Meat shouldn't be sweet." Another added, wrinkling her nose. Yet the smell lingered, threading through the air like a slow, moving ghost. As night fell, and the last embers dimmed, the scent clung to their clothes, their hair, their thoughts. It followed them into the barracks, where they lay awake on wooden bunks, listening to the wind move through the cracks. One woman whispered into the dark, "Do you think it tastes good?" No one answered. The next morning, the shawarma stand returned, and again the same ritual. The sizzling meat, the wafting aroma, the silent onlookers. But this time, a few of the women stayed closer. They watched longer. One of them, the young one with the blue eyes, dared to step forward until she was only a few feet from the fence. She pretended to be sweeping, but her gaze never left the turning spit. The cook caught her looking. He raised an eyebrow, smiling again. Then, without a word, he sliced a small piece, placed it on a piece of bread, and set it on the edge of the barrel near the fence. She froze. Every instinct screamed to walk away. It was the food of the enemy, cooked by the men who had captured them, who had seen them stripped of their uniforms and dignity. To accept it would mean lowering her head, admitting weakness. But the smell, the warmth. For a long time she stood there, torn between pride and hunger, between defiance and curiosity. And finally, she turned away, not out of hatred but fear. Fear of wanting it too much. Behind her, another woman, older, sterner, hissed, "Don't you dare!" But the young girl could still smell it, could still imagine the taste. She hadn't even tried. And when she returned to the barracks, her thoughts refused to quiet. For the rest of that week, The shawarma spit turned daily. The Americans cooked it for themselves mostly, sometimes offering it to the guards. The women pretended not to care, but something subtle had shifted. Every time the smell rolled through the camp, their conversations paused. Every time the fire crackled, their eyes flicked toward it. It was a battle of wills now, hunger versus pride. Some nights, they dreamed of it. Of warm bread, of meat that didn't come from a tin, of spices they didn't recognize but longed to taste. And yet each morning they rose, straightened their hair, and told themselves, no, we will not eat their food. But pride cannot fill an empty stomach. By the second week, even the most stubborn among them had begun to weaken. The rations had thinned, smaller portions, less flavor, more emptiness. The Americans, stretched by post-war shortages, gave what they could. Still, every time the shawarma appeared, it was a feast compared to the grey stew and dry bread that awaited them. The young woman with blue eyes found herself watching again. The flames reflected in her pupils like stars trapped behind glass. She hated herself for wanting it. She hated the war for taking away everything that once made food feel human. And yet, standing there, she realized something. This wasn't humiliation. This wasn't surrender. It was life. Simple, hot, fragrant life. She reached out, not yet to take, just to feel the heat of the fire through the fence. And somewhere deep inside her, a small part of her hunger turned into something else. Something like hope. That night, she lay awake again, listening to the distant laughter of the American cooks. The sound wasn't cruel this time. It was light, almost joyful. It reminded her of nights long ago. Before the sirens, before the uniforms, before the silence. She whispered to herself, barely audible, maybe it doesn't smell so bad. In the morning, she would still turn away when they brought the shawarma cart again. She would still stand tall among the others, pretending not to notice. But inside her, the battle had already shifted. The smell no longer belonged to the enemy. It belonged to memory, to something forgotten, to a world where food meant comfort, not control. And though she didn't yet know it, that smell, that strange, foreign shawarma, would soon change everything. By the third week, the air in the camp had changed. The weather was growing colder, and the mornings carried the sharp bite of early autumn. Dew clung to the fences, shining like glass beads on the strands of barbed wire. Every sound seemed to echo louder in the stillness. The clang of the mess tins, the boots of guards crunching gravel, the tired murmurs of women counting days that no longer meant anything. Food was still the rhythm that ruled their lives. It arrived like clockwork, twice a day. Rations of bread that had gone hard at the edges, watery stew, or sometimes beans from an old can stamped with a date long past. The women ate in silence, their eyes lowered, their hands shaking from hunger. Pride had become thin, like the fabric of their worn coats. But every few days, the smell of something different drifted into the air again, that same strange, tantalizing scent that had haunted their sleep. The shawarma stand. The Americans still cooked it, laughing and talking as they sliced meat off the rotating spit. The fire crackled and the fat hissed, releasing a perfume of garlic, pepper, and something else they could never name. It made their mouths water even as they looked away, pretending not to care. Yet hunger doesn't understand pride. The young woman with blue eyes, her name was Elsa, had begun to linger closer to the fence. Not enough to draw attention, but close enough to breathe it in, to watch the knife's rhythm as it carved through the meat, the thin curls falling perfectly onto the bread. She would tell herself she was only watching, not wanting. But every time, her heart beat faster. Her stomach clenched harder. She wasn't alone. Others had started watching too, quiet, cautious, curious. They whispered about it at night in the barracks, half mocking, half longing. "I heard it's sweet," one said, wrinkling her nose. "Sweet meat." "That's unnatural," another replied. But then a pause. Still it must be warm. Warm. That word had become a kind of fantasy. One morning, when the sky was heavy with clouds and the camp was quieter than usual, the Americans rolled the shawarma cart closer to the fence. The guards were relaxed that day, smoking, talking. The prisoners lined up for their regular meal, but Elsa hesitated at the back of the line, glancing toward the stand. The smell was everywhere, thick and rich and maddening. Then it happened. A small commotion near the kitchen. One of the guards gestured toward the prisoners, holding up a plate. It was the first time they'd offered it. Maybe they had leftovers, maybe it was a test, or maybe it was kindness. No one knew. But the effect was immediate. The women froze. No one moved. The guard called again, waving the plate. "You take it," he said in broken German. Elsa's heart thumped in her chest. No one else stepped forward. She looked around. The older women glared, their faces hard with suspicion. Accepting food from the enemy was shameful. It meant lowering one's head, admitting dependence. But Elsa's hunger was louder than pride now. She took a step, and then another. The guard smiled faintly, amused. He handed her the plate through the wire. A piece of soft bread folded around steaming slices of meat, a drizzle of creamy sauce, a hint of lemon. The warmth seeped into her fingers. She held it like a fragile treasure, unsure what to do. The smell was overwhelming up close, smoky, sharp, alive. It reminded her of nothing she'd ever eaten, and yet it spoke to something ancient inside her. She hesitated. Everyone was watching. Her hands trembled as she lifted it toward her mouth. She took a small bite. Hesitant, testing. The taste exploded like nothing she had known. The meat was tender, the sauce tangy, the bread soft enough to melt on her tongue. Her eyes widened. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The cold air, the wire fence, the staring faces, all vanished. It wasn't just food. It was warmth. It was life. The women around her gasped quietly, some with envy, some with disbelief. Elsa swallowed, looking down at the half-eaten shawarma in her hands, then took another bite, slower this time, savoring it. Her lips trembled as if she might cry. Across the yard, the cook, Corporal Dunn, watched her, expression unreadable. He didn't speak, but he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something sacred that had just happened. That single act, one woman taking one bite, broke something invisible in the camp. The next day, 2 more women stepped forward, then 5, then a dozen. Each one hesitated, each one resisted, and then surrendered to the hunger that had made them human again. At first, they ate quietly, stealing bites in corners, pretending it meant nothing, but soon it became a ritual. When the shawarma stand appeared, so did the crowd, cautious but curious, guarded but open. The Americans noticed too. They started making extra portions, handing them out with quiet smiles. No speeches, no commands, just food. Something began to change between the captors and the captured. There were still fences, still orders, still rules. But there was also the shared silence of people eating together, the moment when chewing replaced argument, when warmth replaced suspicion. The Germans learned that shawarma wasn't some mysterious code word or trick. It was simply food, a dish from far away, born from war and migration. brought to this unlikely place by soldiers who had eaten it across oceans. And with every bite, the bitterness melted a little more. Elsa found herself returning to the fence each day, waiting for the smell to rise again. She still felt the sting of humiliation sometimes, the knowledge that she was dependent on those who had once been her enemies. But when she ate, that feeling vanished. In its place came something quieter, something she hadn't felt in years: gratitude. One afternoon, as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in days, she saw one of the American cooks showing another prisoner how to slice the meat. The women laughed awkwardly, fumbling with the knife. The Americans clapped, cheering her attempt. Elsa couldn't help but smile. It was so strange how quickly a single meal could soften hearts that war had hardened for years. For some of the older women, it was harder. They refused to try it still, muttering that it was foreign, dirty, on German, but even they began to falter when the smell reached their bunks at night. Hunger doesn't discriminate, and pride doesn't cook dinner. By the end of that week, the shawarma stand had become something more than just a kitchen. It was a small space of peace, fragile, temporary, but real. The Americans and the German women would never speak as equals, never forget what separated them. But for a few minutes each day, when the meat sizzled and the bread was handed over, there was no victory, no defeat, only survival, and something that looked very much like forgiveness. Elsa would later remember that first bite for the rest of her life. She would remember the warmth of the food against her hands, the sting of tears she refused to shed, the sound of her fellow prisoners whispering in disbelief. In that bite, the war had ended, not on maps or in treaties, but in her heart. She never told anyone, but sometimes, when she chewed, she thought she could taste home. Not Germany, but humanity. And as the days went on, even the guards began to notice the difference. The camp grew quieter, softer. There were fewer fights, fewer outbursts. The women began to talk again, not about politics or blame, but about life, about food, about memories that had been buried beneath years of fear. The shawarma became a kind of language between them all, a bridge of flavor, a peace treaty made with bread instead of paper. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Elsa caught sight of Corporal Dunn again. He was cleaning the grill, humming something under his breath. She didn't know the song, but it sounded familiar, like something her father used to hum while fixing the roof. She wanted to speak, to thank him, perhaps, but the words stuck in her throat, so instead she did something else. She smiled, and he smiled back. No words, no apology. Just a nod between two people who had seen too much of war and found, for a moment, something that wasn't war at all. Later that night, when Elsa lay on her bunk, the camp felt different, quieter. She could hear someone softly humming the same tune from outside, and someone else laughing, a sound so rare it startled her. For the first time since her capture, she slept deeply. In her dreams, the fences were gone, and the fire was still burning, and the smell of shawarma, that same smoky, sweet perfume, rose into the open night sky, blending with the stars. When morning came, she woke with tears on her face and a strange feeling in her chest, not sorrow, not joy, but something in between. The kind of feeling that told her the world might never be the same again. Because sometimes it only takes a single bite to change everything. Weeks later, the camp had transformed in ways no one could have imagined. The fences were still there, the guards still patrolled, and the sound of boots still echoed across the gravel paths. But something invisible had changed in the air. A lightness, a rhythm, a hum of quiet connection. The war had ended on paper months ago, but in this small guarded corner of Germany, peace was finally beginning to breathe. Every evening, as the sun sank beyond the horizon and the air turned cool, the smell of grilled meat and bread began to rise once again. The shawarma stand had become a ritual, not an official one, but something human, something unspoken. The women gathered in small groups near the fence, waiting not for orders or rations, but for warmth, for taste, for the flicker of firelight that reminded them of home. The Americans knew it too. They could see it in the way the women's faces softened when the first smoke curled upward, in how laughter now replaced the tense silence that once ruled the camp. Elsa stood near the front now, no longer hiding behind others. She had grown thinner, yes, but stronger somehow. The hollowness in her face had given way to color again, faint but real. Every time she watched the Americans prepare the shawarma, she noticed the small details, the rhythm of the knife, the sizzling of the meat, the way one soldier always checked the fire temperature with the back of his hand, as if he could feel its soul. It had become a kind of dance. One side cooking, the other watching, both pretending not to care, but caring deeply all the same. And then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. The Americans invited them in. Not all of them. Just a few trusted prisoners, women who had shown cooperation, who had helped with laundry or medical tents. Elsa was among them. When the call came, she hesitated, unsure if she'd heard right. An invitation. Inside the kitchen area, inside the camp's heart, the guards led them past the fence. The women walked slowly, their steps careful, their eyes darting between the soldiers. The smell was stronger now, spices, smoke, a touch of lemon. Elsa's pulse quickened. It wasn't fear this time. It was anticipation. When they reached the makeshift kitchen, the scene before them felt almost surreal. Wooden tables lined with bread, trays of vegetables, knives glinting in the light. The American cook, Corporal Dunn, was there again, smiling faintly as he turned the meat on the spit. He looked at them and spoke in slow, simple English. "Today," he said, pointing at the food, "you cook with us." The words landed like a spark in the cold air. The women exchanged looks of disbelief. One of them laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke. Another whispered under her breath, "They want us to help." But Dunn simply nodded and handed Elsa a knife. "Cut," he said, showing her the motion. Thin, even slices down the curve of the meat. Her hands trembled as she took it. It had been so long since anyone had trusted her with anything sharp. For a moment, the weight of the blade in her hand reminded her she was still alive, still capable. She mimicked his movement, awkward at first, then smoother with each stroke. The knife made a soft shack sound as it cut, the juices sizzling when they hit the coals below. The smell was overwhelming, but comforting. It filled her chest with warmth she hadn't felt since before the war. One of the older women began kneading dough beside an American soldier. She muttered something in German about how the bread was too soft, and the soldier laughed, shaking his head. He tried to repeat the word, "brot," stumbling over it, and she couldn't help but smile. That smile, small, hesitant human, broke the ice. Soon, they were working side by side. The Americans taught them how to season the meat, how to mix yogurt and garlic into the creamy sauce, how to wrap the bread just tight enough so it wouldn't fall apart. The Germans, in turn, showed them how to stretch the dough thinner, how to use less oil, how to keep the fire steady. It wasn't just cooking anymore. It was communion. For hours, the sound of laughter replaced orders. English and German words mingled together, broken, half understood, but enough. Hands that once clenched in fear now moved with purpose, slicing, stirring, wrapping, tasting. And for the first time, there was no us and them. When the food was ready, they ate together under the fading light. Plates passed from hand to hand, laughter spilled between bites, and the smell of shawarma rose into the twilight like incense at a shared altar. Elsa sat beside Dunn, chewing slowly, savoring each mouthful. The flavors no longer felt foreign. They felt familiar, like something that had been waiting all along for her to understand it. She looked around at the faces, German, American, young, old, and realized that everyone looked softer in the firelight. War had carved lines into their faces, but tonight those lines seemed to fade. There were no speeches, no apologies, just food and the unspoken truth that sometimes peace doesn't begin with treaties. It begins with a shared meal. When the plates were empty and the fire began to die down, no one wanted to leave. The soldiers lingered. The women whispered quietly among themselves, reluctant to let the moment end. Elsa leaned back, watching the smoke drift upward into the darkening sky. It reminded her of prayers, the kind her mother used to whisper before dinner, when she still believed the world was good. Dunn stood, brushing ash from his hands. He looked at the women, then at the fire. "Tomorrow," he said, pointing at the spit. "You cook." The women blinked, unsure they understood. Then, slowly, smiles spread across their faces, and so it became a new routine. Every few evenings, the women would help prepare the shawarma themselves. They experimented, sometimes adding onions, sometimes herbs they found near the fence. The Americans joked that it was German-style shawarma, and the women laughed, taking pride in it. For the first time since capture, they were creating something, not merely surviving. It wasn't just about the food anymore. It was about dignity. The shawarma stand had turned from a symbol of division into one of unity. The fences still stood, yes, but now they felt less like cages and more like lines waiting to be erased. One evening a storm rolled over the camp. Rain poured down in sheets, soaking the ground, drenching everything. The fire sputtered and hissed, but the women refused to let it die. They huddled beneath a makeshift tarp, holding the spit steady, laughing as the wind whipped around them. Dunn rushed out with extra wood, shouting something about crazy Germans, but his grin betrayed affection, not anger. When the fire finally stabilized, Elsa stood beside him, both soaked, both shivering. She looked at him and said, haltingly, "No war, only food." He paused, looking at her, then nodded slowly. "Only food." That simple exchange said everything. When the meal was ready, they ate standing under the rain, steam rising from the shawarma, laughter cutting through the storm. It was ridiculous, beautiful, unforgettable. From that night on, the shawarma stand was no longer just a camp kitchen. It was the heart of a small miracle, proof that humanity could survive even after nations had torn each other apart. By the time winter arrived, many of the prisoners had been reassigned or released. The camp was quieter now. The fires burned less often, but the smell of grilled meat still lingered in the wood and in memory. On her final day before transfer, Elsa stood at the fence one last time. The snow had begun to fall soft and silent. Dunn was there, turning the spit alone. She watched him for a while, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. When he noticed her, he smiled faintly and held up a small piece of shawarma wrapped in paper. She hesitated, then reached out through the wire and took it. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. She took a bite, closing her eyes. It tasted just as it had the first time, smoky, warm, alive. But now it carried something more: memory, peace, understanding. When she opened her eyes again, Dunn was gone. Only the smoke remained, curling upward into the grey sky like a final whisper of what they had shared. Years later, when Elsa was free and rebuilding her life in a ruined village, she tried to recreate that dish. She never quite got it right. The spices were different, the bread too thick, the heat uneven. But every time she made it, she felt the same warmth return, and when her children asked where she had learned it, she would smile softly and say, "From the Americans. In a place where I thought I'd forgotten how to live." In her small kitchen, far from the wire and the watchtowers, she would turn the meat slowly over the fire, the scent filling her home. She would hum a tune she could barely remember, something an American once hummed long ago beside a flame. Food, she had learned, could end wars long after the guns went silent. Because peace isn't always written on paper. Sometimes it's grilled, sliced, and shared under a storm.